Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so thank you for watching. As you said, I'm Russell Sensei, or Matthew, and I just want to talk a little bit about TPRS, or Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling, as we also call it. So just let me get here we go. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second here. Okay, so I was reading with my son, who I speak Japanese to, and I asked him, 読んであげようか? この本を読んであげようか? And I realized that if I had said that to my students, their heads would have exploded. Like, there's so much language there if you look at it from like a grammar rule perspective. So to understand that, they'd have to know yomu, they'd have to be able to put that into the te form, they'd have to know ageru versus kureru, they'd have to be able to put that into the volitional form, ageo, add the ka, and they'd have to know how to put that all together, which is really challenging for most Japanese students. So I started thinking about why I'm teaching Japanese and like what my goal is. So I came to the conclusion that my goal isn't to teach about the rules of the language, but just to teach the language. So kind of in a similar way as I teach it to my son, I teach it to my students. So I kind of avoid all the grammar rules and just go for, let's use the language how it's used. So really quick, CI is another word that comes up when talking about this kind of stuff. Most of you have probably heard it. Simply means comprehensible input. So the idea is, for it to be a useful resource for the students, they have to understand most of what is there. If they don't understand it, they're not going to learn anything from it. So instead of giving them a whole bunch of really difficult problems and stuff, giving them long readings that they can understand, and then pick up the few words that they don't know and really cement their understanding of the words that they already know, and see lots of examples of those in natural settings. Okay, so TPRS specifically, again, we get to the purpose of language. So if this was a regular presentation, I'd ask the audience now what the purpose of language is. Usually someone says communication. Most people agree that that's kind of a base purpose of language. We find it a little bit harder to define what communication is. So the definition that's being used in TPRS is communication is expression, interpretation, and sometimes negotiation of meaning in a given context. Basically saying that for it to be real communication, it has to be in a context. You can't take just one sentence by itself and call that communication. It needs to be part of a conversation or part of a story. There has to be some reason they want to know what the meaning of that sentence is. That particular quote's from a guy named Bill Van Patten, who's done a lot of research on this area. Okay, I don't have time to get into a lot of the research, but for those of you that are interested in the research, TPRS Books has a huge list of all the research done on TPRS and stuff on their website. So you're more than welcome to take a look there. And I'll go back to the beginning of the presentation at the end so you can get the link for this presentation if you want any of the links that are in it. Okay, so first thing they talk about in TPRS is that the input that the students are getting has to be rich. So rich stands for repetitive, interesting, comprehensible, and high frequency. So when I was first teaching, I was teaching with the Genki textbook for a little while, and I open up chapter 1 and I see, you guys probably remember better than me, but I don't know, 50 to 100 vocab words in just chapter 1. And then you just over and over and over again, more and more and more vocab. And I was finding that my students weren't retaining most of the vocab. So we really try to limit it down to choosing the most high frequency words that they're going to be able to use all the time and make sure they know those words really well. So it's really important that we're careful with what words we introduce so that we can be most efficient with our time, because we have so much less time than someone learning it as a native speaker. The comprehensible I talked about before, if they can't understand it, it's not going to stick in their brain. Interesting. Again, this has to do a lot with the fact that I teach high school as well, in that I really have to keep their interest, otherwise they're going to zone out on me and not do anything. So that's really helpful. But for anyone, it helps to be interesting and repetitive. That comes from really narrowing it to the high frequency words. So if you limit yourself to a certain list of words, or try to really limit the number of words you use, you automatically become repetitive using those words. So they hear it over and over and over again, and they learn it without even realizing that they've learned it. So when students first walk into my class in grade 9, having no Japanese before, this is what they see on the projector screen. So our first class, we just chat basically. So I put this up and I start off with something like, watashi wa rasuru sensei desu. Okay, and I will say something like, sensei wa aisu cream ga suki desu. And I'll do gestures and I'll point to the screen as I'm doing this. And after I've done it a few times and gotten a few repetitions, I can go to the students. So I'll point to someone and say, oh, aisu cream ga suki desu ka? Hai, iie. And getting them responding right away. And it's really easy to get lots of repetitions, because after you ask them if they like ice cream, you can say, oh, well, do you like vanilla ice cream? Or do you like chocolate ice cream? Do you like Haagen-Dazs, or do you like Breyers? And there's often lots of discussion around that. I'll often even take a poll. So, dare ga Breyers ga suki desu ka? Dare ga Haagen-Dazs ga suki desu ka? And I'll write it up on the board, and it just creates interest in the class. But in that first class, I'll use the pattern suki desu or watashi wa something desu easily 100 times each. So they get distracted by all the fun little details, but by the time they've done the first class, they know those like fairly well. So just so you can see what's going on here, the ice cream I use is the thing I like. And then of course I want the negative as well. So that's the Tabasco sauce. And then I usually find a student that likes Tabasco sauce, and I'm like, oh, Tabasco sauce ga suki desu ka? Tabasco no ice cream ga suki desu ka? Just any little silly thing like that I can come up with to get a laugh or keep interest, and constantly asking questions. I'll talk a little bit more about the specific type of questions I ask on a later slide. Okay. So then we move on to this slide. This is just me with my family, and this gets lots of repetitions as well, because I introduce myself, and then I introduce my wife, Lisa, and my son Kai, and I can ask them things like, oh, sensei no kodomo no namae wa Lisa desu ka? Sore tomo sensei no kodomo no namae wa Kai desu ka? So just constantly repeating and always following up with questions. This can be particularly amusing with high school students, because again, after I talk about myself and get them comfortable with the words, I turn it to them. So I'll ask them, okusan imasu ka? Kodomo imasu ka? I'll ask them that, and sometimes they'll play along and make up some silly story about how another student in the class is their son or something like that. And we're just constantly with the suki and desu and arimasu, imasu, arimasen, imasen, just over and over again. And at this point, I'm not too concerned when they accidentally say kodomo ga arimasu. I'll repeat it back to them correctly, like we're using imasu. But I'm not too concerned if they get that wrong. I'm only concerned if they're understanding what I'm saying. I worry about them responding perfectly later. Because if they understand it and hear it often enough, generally they get it without me having to do anything. Okay, so here is the questioning that I was talking about. There's a lot of questions in this method. So each time you introduce some sort of new detail, you can go back and ask questions about it, as well as the previous details you've asked about. So this is a general format right here. Although once you get used to it, you don't necessarily do every one of these in order every time. So you start off with yes, then no, a which question, what, who, and then one of the other ones. Number 6 there, the when, where, how much, I don't usually use too much right at the beginning. That's kind of later after they're more used to things. Those get a little bit trickier. But to use my ice cream example, I'd ask a question like, Rasuru sensei wa ice cream ga suki desu ka? And then I can go on to, Rasuru sensei wa Tabasco sauce ga suki desu ka? To prompt them to give a no answer. Rasuru sensei wa ice cream ga suki desu ka? Sore tomo Tabasco sauce ga suki desu ka? And just down the list, Rasuru sensei wa nani ga suki desu ka? Dare ga ice cream ga suki desu ka? Sorry, I just did that out of habit. The question words, I do gestures along with it, as well as anything else I can do gestures with. So dare, doko, what. It really helps clue them in right at the beginning, even when they're having trouble remembering the words right from day one. Helps me stay in Japanese more. Yeah, so this is a big one. I've been doing this, actually I made this presentation a little while ago, so 2.5, 3 years now I've been doing this, and I can never go back to what I was doing before. So when I was first teaching Japanese, I found my students were really good at translating individual sentences that were using the grammar patterns that we were covering in whatever chapter we were in. But if I gave them even like a paragraph, they were having a really hard time getting through it, even if it was really simple Japanese. So now I regularly give my students multi-page stories, and they just read through them as long as they're at their level. We do a lot of reading, and they have no problem reading a few pages in their 10 minutes of reading time. So that's been really huge, seeing that. Number 2, and this is probably my favorite right here, I've had multiple grade 9 students come up to me this year as well already saying, I can understand everything you say, I just can't say it myself, which to me is amazing because I try to stay in Japanese as much as possible in class. So at grade 9, having just started Japanese in September, if they can understand everything I'm saying, to me that's a win. It's going to come out broken when they try to say it some of the time, but personally I don't mind. For me, grade 9 is all about them understanding and feeling successful. So then by the time they're in grade 10, 11, and 12, it starts naturally coming out. Okay, nice little bonus. I don't know if everyone is concerned about this as I am. Japanese programs can be hard to keep alive at times. So my Japanese program doubled in size since I started doing this. So I'm up to about 75 students now, which is much better than I was doing before. Okay. I know it's not a popularity contest for teachers and classes and everything, but to keep the program alive, and also just for people to be successful in the language, they have to be motivated to learn it. So if they don't love Japanese, they're not going to get good at it because they're not going to continue with it. So this is a really big one for me, that they really enjoy the class. I also have many students that have designations in my classes, and I almost never end up having an EA, an educational assistant, in with them because generally they don't need it. This type of learning is something that anyone that can already speak English is used to in some way or another. So I often don't notice that they have designations, depending on the seriousness of it, of course, when they're in this class. Whereas when I was doing the traditional methods, it was quite noticeable right away. And again, it just comes back to what is my overall goal? Why am I teaching them Japanese? It's for communication. So now with my grade, particularly with my grade 11 to 12 students, we start every class with 20 minutes of Japanese only, and we just chat. I ask them like, "Kino nani shimashita ka?" And we talk about what they watched on Netflix, or where they went with their friend, or what class they did homework for. And we just chat for 20 minutes about any topics that we can come up with. So that's been really great because there's built-in interest there whenever they're talking about themselves. And if they're able to talk like that, I feel like I've done my job in giving them some basics of Japanese communication. This is just another example of when I want them to talk a little bit more. I have them make this on, I think it was the first or second day. They put together one slide with their name, something they like, something they don't like, and a pet. And the pet can be real or imaginary, doesn't matter. And all this does is it gives me, there's 25 students in the class, it gives me 25 more chances to do the same thing I did with my slide on the very first class. I can ask Brian, 名前は何ですか? Brian はアイスクリームが好きですか? Or それとも Brian はゴキブリが好きですか? And strangely enough, because of this slide, all my grade 9s now still remember gokiburi. Not the most high frequency word, but they really enjoy it. So all my students do this, so we get to chat. And it gets really funny. One of them put their pet as their iPhone. One of them put their pet as Tom Holland wearing Spider-Man costume. So again, just any excuse to chat. And they really get into this, and it doesn't matter if they're really confident in their Japanese yet, because I really guide it with questions. Yeah, so that's this kino nani shimashita ka is what I do at the senior levels. And these are the kind of expansions of that. I always try and drag a little bit more out of them. Anyone that talks to teenagers know they like their short answers and then they stop. So always prodding them with as many more questions as I can. And then as I'm talking to them, every once in a while, I'll pause and I'll turn to the class, say, みんな、エリアノラは昨日何しましたか? 誰としましたか? 楽しかったですか? Ask them all as a class. If they get something wrong, that gives me a chance to go back to Eleonora and say, oh, Eleonora, 昨日何しましたか? みんな、昨日エリアノラ何しましたか? So again, just so many repetitions of the patterns. And this is really easy to switch out kino for 先週、今週、来週、先月、今月. Lots of different words I can sneak in there. What are we doing for time? Okay, so this bit here, asking a story, this is kind of the main bit of TPRS in most people's views. So basically, I get up in front of the class after we've done our opening stuff with the slides and everything. So they have some language. They can say someone is something. They can say someone likes something. And then we do asking a story. So what that is they help supply the details of the story so that they're still interested in it. So generally this starts out with me asking the class a question. Okay, みんな、誰がいますか? And they'll give me a character. Usually they start off with some boring suggestion like John or something. So I'll prod them to do something that's a little bit more interesting. Characters have included everything from Marilyn Monroe to Kim Jong-il to my baby. So any added interest there is helpful. I also always ask them for the locations of the stories, because it doesn't matter for the Japanese, but again, it gives them interest and it helps them feel a little bit of ownership over the story, like they're doing it together. They're not just sitting there listening to the teacher. So this is kind of an example of a standard, I know there's kind of a lot there. Hopefully you can all see it okay. This is kind of a standard TPRS story format. So you start off with, there is someone. That person is, you can give usually like one detail about them, their name or some adjective or something. You move on to, where they are, and then something they like or they want. Because then the rest of the story is going to be about them trying to get that. So, ureshii Bob wa pizza ga suki desu. Demo ureshii Bob wa pizza ga arimasen. So he goes to Timbuktu, but there's no pizza in Timbuktu. And all these details, pretty much everything in English there, Bob, Boston, pizza, Timbuktu, Alaska, all of those are details that would be supplied by the students. I wouldn't supply those. I would ask them, okay, Bob wa pizza ga suki desu. だから Bob wa doko ni ikimasu ka? So they'll give me some suggestions and I'll choose whichever one seems best and we'll move on from there. And again, as we're going through here, we're constantly doing the circling that I was talking about before. So after we go through a couple sentences, I'll go back and ask, Bob wa ureshii desu ka? Sore tomo ureshiku nai desu ka? So they have to not only understand the words, but they have to remember it in the context of the story. So it's the actual content. And it's really helpful giving them that context. Like we were talking about before with communication, the context is really important to help them understand it and really retain it. The other thing that I want to point out here that was just a mind-blowing moment for me is with my characters, I always attach an adjective to them. So you'll notice it's not just otoku no ko ga imasu, it's ureshii otoku no ko ga imasu. I stumbled onto that by accident, but it gives so many repetitions of that particular adjective that whatever adjective I choose, by the end of the story, they'll remember it forever. That happened by accident when they wanted a story called Naked Mario, and now everyone knows Hadaka, but it works great for any adjective. As soon as it's in front of the character, it gets so many repetitions that they always remember it. Okay, so to stretch the story out, because just to give you a reference, I never or rarely start and end a story on the same day. So I'll start it, we'll introduce the character, maybe go to one location, and then by then, end of class, so we'll move on to the next day. It often takes me, if it's a decent story they're interested in, about a week. So for me, that's about 3 classes to finish a story. It can be longer or shorter depending on what else we're doing in class. So to stretch the story out, if they're having, the key in TPRS is if they're having trouble with something, you can't introduce the new detail or the new pattern until they're really comfortable with the one that you've already introduced. So for example, they're really not getting the imas versus arimas. For the locations, when you say, okay, Bob wa doko ni ikimasu ka? Or let's say Bob wa doko ni imasu ka? And they give you Alaska. I can keep that going by saying, Bob wa Alaska ni imasu. Bob wa Alaska no doko ni imasu ka? And we often end up getting things like Bob wa Alaska no McDonald's ni imasu. Any little details like that, and it just gives more and more repetitions. It lets me ask more doko questions, and it gives them a lot of fun trying to come up with unique suggestions. This is another one. I don't do this for my first couple stories, but once they get more comfortable, each time a character goes to a new location, they talk to someone there. So instead of just going to a location and finding out it doesn't have what they need, they'll go to a location, meet someone, and then have a conversation with that person saying, oh, I want pizza. Will you give me pizza? And that person can respond accordingly. For example, this is really great for teaching agemasu and kuremasu. in context, because you can actually do it in the conversation in a natural way instead of just trying to explain it to the students. And they just hear it so often, again, it doesn't really turn into a problem. Having an adjective for each character I already mentioned. It's probably my favorite one here. Asking the students. So again, we can, it used to be a problem when I was teaching that I would always go off on tangents. But in TPRS, it's not a problem, it's amazing. So for example, we're talking about a story with the character wants coffee. And I feel like the students need a little bit more repetition or a little bit more energy. So instead of going on into the story, I'll ask a student, oh, Amelia wa kohi ga hoshii desu ka? And then I can ask them something like, minna, Starbucks no kohi ga hoshii desu ka? Sore tomo Tim Hortons no kohi ga hoshii desu ka? And get the discussion going like that. And then when they're ready and they're all engaged again, we go right back into the story. And of course, at any time, I can pause the story and ask, minna, Amelia wa kohi hoshii desu ka? So it just keeps them really on their toes and bringing the students in. When I do talk to an individual student, when I ask an individual student a question, they do give me a full sentence response, even if it's pretty much repeating what I say. If they don't quite have the language yet, I will prod them. But when I talk to them individually, they'll give me a full sentence response. If I talk to them as a class, it's generally just hi, iie, Boston, Bob, just one word answers. This is one I'm not great at yet, but a lot of people are. They use actors to actually become characters in the story and act it out. And they also use parallel characters. Parallel characters are very similar to what I was just talking about with asking the students, except if the students are too shy to share, you can make up a parallel character like Brad Pitt. And then we can make up all sort of funny, silly details about Brad Pitt as they relate to whatever story we happen to be doing. And then it also gives a chance to kind of make fun of Brad Pitt a little bit, whereas we never want to do that with real students, of course. So having the parallel characters, just made up characters, can also add a lot of interest. The students find it hilarious. Okay, so this is really key. Don't rush to finish, but don't be afraid to kill the story. So part of the rich is the interesting, and some stories the kids love, and I've been on a story for 2 weeks, and the kids love it, and as long as they love it, I'm happy to keep going with it. But I've had stories where it's pretty clear 15 minutes into the story that this is just not grabbing the kids' attention. It's not something they're at all interested in. In that case, I just find a quick way to conclude the story. And next class, we start with a brand new story. Because the point isn't to finish the story, it's to get the Japanese repeated over and over in their heads as much as possible. 10 minutes. Okay, so after the story, I always give them readings. So the reading might be the story that we just did, or more often it will be a different story, but using the same vocab and stuff in the story that we were working on. Sometimes they'll read it on their own. Sometimes they'll do something called ping pong reading, where one person reads the Japanese, the other person translates, and then back and forth. And sometimes I'll give them comprehension questions or ask them to translate a little bit. But the important thing is just, okay, they've heard it now, they've heard it and been saying it. Now let's get them reading it to make sure that the understanding is really there. Write and discuss is how I start my students off with writing. And I still do this with my senior students too, though. After a story is done, I generally pretend, or truly, forget what the story was about or some of the details of the story. So this gives me a chance to review the entire story. Oh, class, minna, dare ga imashita ka? Doko ni ikimashita ka? And we'll write it down together. I'll type it up on the projector and then they write it down on their sheets. So that's how they get started in a really easy way with writing full sentences, because they give the answers, but then I'll write it down so they can be confident that what they're writing is correct. Cartoons. This is really great to get them to reread the story a number of times. I have them do cartoons where they're not allowed to use any words. So it's just images. So they have to reread the story a number of times, try and picture it in their head, and try to think of how they're going to represent that. It tends to make them reread it more than just asking them a couple questions. I found if I just ask them questions, some of them have gotten pretty good at scanning for keywords and just reading the bits that they need to answer the questions. Although, yeah, sometimes I do a comprehension quiz, so just basic questions on it. And here we have assessment. So a lot of people wonder with TPRS how we manage assessment if we're not going to be teaching this grammar rule and then take a test on that grammar rule. The assessment that we do is based on comprehension. So instead of asking them to conjugate a bunch of verbs for me, I'll give them a reading and I'll either have them translate it or answer some questions for me about it to prove that they understood the whole reading. The great part about this is I don't give them any warning. All the words are words that they know, that we've been doing in the story, that we've been doing in class, and they know it's their responsibility if they don't understand something in class to ask me. So there's no warning. Anything we've done in class is fair game, and they just read it and answer. And I've been really pleasantly surprised with how well they do generally. Okay. This is another thing that's a little different for a lot of language teachers. I don't care if they make mistakes. So when I'm first getting them to write, or if I'm giving them a quiz on comprehension, I don't take marks off if they use imas instead of arimas, or if they accidentally use past tense, or if they forget the small tsu in ureshikatta. If I can read it and understand it, I'm happy that they've understood the Japanese and been able to produce something. That means that it's getting there. I also do some self-assessed participation instead of interviews. So I'll interview them sometimes to see how their words are coming along. But I don't want to do this all the time. So I give them a Google form every 2 weeks or so, and they mark themselves on how well they've been participating in class. I can justify this because basically if they're participating in class, it means I'm actually hearing them speak and they're proving that they're understanding what I'm saying in class. For the people that are a little too shy to participate well in class, they can come see me and chat with me for a little bit to show me that they're understanding. So they don't have to share in class if they're not comfortable. This was another kind of mind-blowing moment for me, or just like a really key thing that I like to focus on now. When I give the students an assessment, are 80% of them at 80% or above. So if I find that they're not, then I have to think, okay, so what didn't I teach them well enough? And since I've been doing TPRS, this has gotten a lot better. No warning needed, I already talked about. And yeah, these are some of the other things. The comics I already talked about. Sometimes that will generally be marked. Again, I'm not worried about the artwork. It's about the comprehension of the story. So if I can look at their cartoon and I could retell the story without missing any important bits, that's a perfect mark. For kids that don't like to draw, they can do it in Google Slides. Quizzes I'll give sometimes I'll have them summarize a story, or we do something called, not directly related to the stories, but we do something called a timed write. So I'll give them 10 minutes to write as much Japanese as they can. And if they get to a certain character count, they get full marks, provided that their Japanese makes sense. And again, in the timed write, I'm not worried about minor mistakes. As long as it makes sense, I'm pretty happy. And I find that it does improve over time, even though I'm not really picky with those small mistakes. Okay, so as far as reading materials, a number of you are probably familiar with Tadoku, the various resources there. So you can check that out for lots of reading. That's particularly if you're doing university, that's probably accessible to some of your younger students. If you have colleagues doing French or Spanish, TPRSbooks.com and fluencyfast.com are great. They've got lots of stuff. They don't have anything in Japanese, unfortunately. It's just not big enough of a market. I have some stuff available at easyjapanesestories.com. And I don't really have, unless people want to ask questions about it, I don't have too much time to get into the different strategies that we use to help them be successful when reading. But I talk about it a little on some YouTube videos I put up about my resources. So I'm not really going to talk about those now, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to message me or check that stuff out anytime. I think, oh yeah, so this is a whole bunch of stuff that we probably don't really have time for. If you copy down the link, any of this stuff that you search for, if you do a little Google search for it, you'll find about 1 billion YouTube videos and blogs from French and Spanish teachers explaining what they are. Most of them are pretty directly transferable to Japanese. You just have to translate them, of course. So that can really be, these can all really be effective activities. The one thing I'd like to point out here, number 10, because I've got a minute left, publishing class stories. I was really struggling to find stories that my high school kids, particularly grade 9s and 10s, could read, enjoy, and feel successful at. So what I started doing is at the end of the year, now I'm going to do it every 2 years, I actually properly print up as a novel, like a proper bound book, the stories that we created together as a class. So we now have in our class library about 10 copies each of the last 2 years of stories that we've done. And new students really enjoy going to see the crazy things about like Kim Jong-il eating my baby and just whatever random stuff that the previous classes came up with. They're all ridiculous, but it's easy, it's at their level, and it's enjoyable. So the kids also get a kick out of it when they see their stories properly printed up in like a book. And I give them credit, they're all in the back. So they kind of enjoy that. I think there's just one last slide here. Yeah. So I talked about a little bit about what you do in a TPRS classroom today. It's not going to fit into a 40-minute presentation, but basically it's all about any excuse to communicate. So whether you're chatting about their day, whether you're creating a story together, whether you're reading, talking about the news, any excuse you can to just communicate with the kids in Japanese, that's what it's all about. Last thing I'll say before we open it up to questions is if any of you are interested in this, it's great if you can get a trainer, or even if you just have someone in your area doing it in French or Spanish, to go in and see what the class looks like. Because I've had, I don't know if she's watching right now, but I've had some people that have watched my presentation. And so I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then watch my class and been like, oh, okay, I get it now. So it's really a big difference if you can actually see it in action. Okay, so I think that's my time for the presentation. So we can open it up to some questions.
はい、ありがとうございます。一つ質問がチャットボックスにあります。
はい。
生徒はアセスメントに日本語で答えるのでしょうか、それとも英語ですか、あるいはレベルによりますか。
僕のルールは、はい、日本語で質問したら日本語で答える。だからなんかもうちょっと簡単な質問、なんか、ラッセル先生は何が好きですかとかだったら、それは日本語で答えてもらう。でも、もうちょっと難しい質問、なんか、なぜとか、もうちょっと難しいのは大体英語で聞く。
それはつまり内容がちゃんと分かっていることが確認できればいいので、別に英語でもいいっていうことですよね。
そうそう。だから特にグレード9のみんなに、最初の方は結構 英語使う。その質問の時。
なるほど。
うん。
はい。ありがとうございます。チャットボックスには今のところ質問はそれだけなので、他に質問がある方はいらっしゃいますか？ちょっと、多分みんな恥ずかしいかもしれないので、僕の方から一つ、
はい。
なんか、リーディングの後で、ピンポンの後に、エアプレインと、コンプリヘンジョンって書いてありましたけど、
ああ、そうね。
はい。
airplane は、まあ、pair reading のテクニックかな。大体みんな、はい、ペアになってリーディングしてくださいって言ったら、そのペアになるまではなんか5分とかかかるじゃないか。だから airplane にする。みんな、airplane みたいに、なんていう、line up two chairs, everyone sits down, and so then they all have their partner, and when I say, okay, we've arrived in Vancouver, then we're going to transfer to New York, I have everyone in one row stand up, they move one seat forward and sit down, and they have a new partner.
なるほど。
So that keeps it really fresh, because if you keep them reading with the same partner all the time, they get bored. So I just kind of wait till the energy goes down, and then I say, okay, they stand up, move one forward, and start wherever the slower student was at.
なるほど。2列に並んで、片方が1つずつずれていって、新しい相手と話をするような、そういうパターンの練習方法っていうことですね。
そう。
はい。ありがとうございます。はい。あとは質問の方いらっしゃらないですか？
誰か。
誰が手を挙げてます？どなた？鈴木さんどうぞ。はい。じゃあ鈴木さんの後、安倍さんお願いします。はい。
失礼します。確認なんですけれども、先生は質問をしますね。生徒は答えます。生徒から質問をするというターンはないんでしょうか？それをお聞きしたいです。
そうか。あまりないかもしれない。あるとしても、なんかストーリーのアクターだったら、そのアクターのセルフでなんか質問とかも入ってると思うけど。
なるほど。はい。じゃあ実際に生徒同士で会話をするとき、答えの会話はたくさん聞いたので出ますけど、まだ質問の文はちょっと出ない様子なんでしょうか？
あまり話さないと思うけど、もう一つの、レビューアクティビティとしては、はい、このストーリーを読んで、5つぐらいの質問を書いてください。それでなんかみんなでゲームする、なんかジェプディとかのゲームする。
なるほど。わかりました。興味深かったです。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。はい。じゃあ次、安倍さん、さっき手を挙げていらっしゃいましたね。はい。安倍さん手を挙げてました。
こんにちは。はい。
どうも。はい。
こんにちは。
はい。
ありがとうございました。とても楽しかったです。はい。ですね、ちょっと質問してもいいですか？じゃあ。
はい。
大体一つのクラスは大体何人ぐらいの学生がいるのかというのと、大体1週間に大体何時間ぐらいのクラスなのかっていうのをちょっとお聞きしたいな。
はい。大体1クラスは20人ぐらい。今一番少ないのは14人から28人のクラスもいる。あと1週間は2時間50分ぐらいかな。
2時間50分。はい。で、例えば、シャドーイングなどの練習とかを組み合わせて授業することはありますか？
シャドーイングは、そうかね。それはあまりしないよね。僕にはなんか、コンプレヘンションが一番だから、それだけ、なんか発音だけの練習はあまりしない。なんか自然的にっていうか、よく聞いて、そしてなんか自動的にちょっとずつ良くなる。
あとは、生徒のバックグラウンドというか、例えば、中国系だったりとか、そういう、どんな学生が多いですか？
そうね。
いろいろな学生側ですか？それとも。
まあ、いろいろ、そうね、中国人も、日本人もいるけど、ハーフは今5、6人ぐらいいて、でも大体困らない。たまに、今2人、あんまり英語わからない中国人がいて、それある時ちょっと困るけど、大体このストーリーだったらよくジェスチャーしたりするから、そんな困らない。
なるほど。ありがとうございます。で、最後の、すいません、たくさん質問してすいません。最後に一つなんですけど、いろんなストーリーを聞いていて、で、学生が自分でストーリーを書きたいとかいうことはありますか？
よく書く。なんか、グレード9だったら、5 sentence story っていうストラクチャーがあります。There is someone, they want something, they go somewhere to get it. They're happy or not happy. Or sorry, it's there or not there, and they're happy or not happy. And then, grade 10, 11, 12のみんなはもうちょっとなんかだんだん長いストーリー書けるようになる。
で、そこで質問なんですけど、今私が考えているのは、先輩が書いたものを後輩が読んで練習するっていう練習を考えているんですけど、そういうことしたことありますか？
それ、クラスストーリーをパブリッシュするときは、それできるけど、今まで僕も結構それしたいと思ってて、ストーリージャンパーというウェブサイトでみんな、絵本を作ってもらった。でも、やっぱり、初めてそういうことやったから、ストラクチャーは足りなかった。だからなんかいろんな小さい日本語の間違いとかあり、難しい言葉使っちゃった生徒たちもいたから、なんか僕は結構、なんていう、エディティングしないと使えないから、まだできてない。したいけど、まだできてない。
わかりました。とても大変参考になりました。本当にありがとうございます。
ありがとう。
はい、他に質問の方いらっしゃったら、宮本さんお願いします。はい。ミュートに、はい。
こんにちは。ありがとうございました。
はい。
ここで今、質問っていうか、やっぱり今やってて、first year の beginner の生徒のひらがなを読むのが遅くて、どこまで今の時点でどのぐらいひらがなが読めるようになったらいいかとか、あとは書くのも、ストーリーを書かしてもすごく時間がかかって、なんかかわいそうになっちゃうんですけど、そういう例はどうしてますか？
そう、今年は初めてちょっといつも違うやり方したから、まだなんていう、研究中っていうか、今年は全然、書く練習させてなかった。そのひらがな練習のパケットみんなにあげたけど、それカスでしません。それなんか時間もったいないかなって思ってた。だからやりたい人はやる。やりたくない人は、しない。でも、今は、なんていう、全部のひらがな読めるじゃないんですけど、よく使うひらがな読めるし、ひらがなのチャートも持ってるし、そんな心配しない。なんか、来年、もうちょっと練習させようかなって思ったけど、もっとリーディングマテリアルがあったら、それが一番かなって思った。
ストーリー読むときは、生徒はひらがなのチャートを見ながら読む。
そう、僕やったのは、一番最初のストーリーは、例えばよくいます、行きますとか、わがを使ったから、それだけをひらがなにして、他の全部はロマン字で書いてた。書くのが結構めんどくさいけど、それだったらよく使う単語結構早く分かってた。 だから僕はあんまりなんか、あいうえおの順番で教えない。なんか、よく使う単語を見て、その順番に教える。
今は全部ひらがなですか？
今全部ひらがな。言ってるのは、今全部ひらがなだけど、いつでも使いたいときはひらがなのチャート使える。でも、スプリングブレイクが終わったら、クイズとかだったら使えない。でも最近結構上手くなった。なんかよくストーリーを書いてもらってるから、それでなんかひらがなを結構もうちょっと良くなった。
書くのは
ひらがな。今は全部ひらがな。
ストーリー書かすときは全部ひらがな。5 sentences。
そうそう。今は全部ひらがな。最初の方は、例えばそのストーリーで行きますと言いますは、ひらがなだったら、それはひらがなで書く。でも、他のはロマ字で書いてもいい。でも今は全部ひらがな。
今でもチャートを見てもいいよってしてひらがな。はい、ありがとうございます。はい。
One thing I'd like to say, if there's university teachers out there, I would still recommend just having them learn it. I wish I could tell my students, okay, you have 2 weeks, learn the hiragana. Let's do that. High school teachers know we can't do that.
はい、ありがとうございます。大学の先生も多分何名かいらっしゃると思いますね。はい。他にご質問の方いらっしゃいましたら。
すいません。
はい。じゃあ、アニコさんの後、望月さん、女性の望月さんですね。お願いします。はい。
マシュー先生の話、興味深く伺いました。ビデオをミュートにしてるので、ちょっと顔が見せられなくてすみません。質問なんですが、ストーリーテリングをする際には、視覚教材が常に必要になるということなのか、それともそれが必要なくて、他の、視覚教材ではなくて別の代わりのものも使えるのかどうかということと、あとその視覚教材を選ぶ際に何か選ぶポイントなどはありますでしょうか？例えば面白さとか、あとマシュー先生の場合は個人的な写真も使っていらっしゃるようなんですが、どういうふうに選べばいいのかということを教えていただけますでしょうか？
一つ、視覚教材はなんか teaching materials だね。
ビジュアルな教材、teaching materials。
ビジュアル、そうか、そうか。ビジュアルだったら、よくっていうか、たまに自分の、日本に住んでたからの時間の写真を見せる。それで見せるだけじゃなくて、それはなんかメインのトピックにして、話す。それとも、読んでるストーリーを見て、これなんか何についてのストーリーかな。それで、写真を選ぶ。なんかよくなんていう会話できそうな写真を選ぶかな。あとなんかムービータークもあるけど、同じようになんかそれ見て、なんかどんなパターンとか単語がいるかなって考えて、どんな質問できるかなと考えて、それ選ぶかな。
わかりました。じゃあ単発で例えば全然全く関係のないイラストを例えば並べて、それに自分たちでストーリー性を生み出していくとか、そういうふうな方法でも。
それもある。なんか全然関係ない写真を見せて、なんか、はい、これでストーリーを作りましょうとか。あと、timed write の時も、たまにそうやって、それは writing prompt にする。なんか、一つの Google スライドでいろんななんか絵とかあって、はい、それはプロンプトとして使って、みんな10分ストーリーを書いてください。
わかりました。ありがとうございます。はい、
はい、ありがとうございます。じゃあ次は T 望月さんお願いします。質問ありましたら。はい。
クラスの最初に20分ぐらい先生とおしゃべりチャットするときに、例えばクラスの中にレベル差があった場合、すごく上手な子がものすごくたくさん先生と話してきたりとか、あとは 日本語で他の子が絶対知らないようなボキャブラリーとか、センテンスパターンを使ってきたりすることがもしあるようでしたら、そういう困った子っていうんですか、非常にモチベーションの高い子に対してどのような対応をしているかちょっと教えていただけると嬉しい。
そう、特に今の、Grade 11、12のクラスに、ハーフの子は3人いて、2人はすごく日本語できる子。だからたまにそういう問題があるんですけど、大体そういうことがあったら、先生が生徒が言ったことを、言い直すっていうか、なんかリフレーズしてちょっと簡単なできるだけ簡単な日本語にして言う。もしそれできなかったら、ちょっと、ホワイトボードにみんなが多分知ってない、単語とか変えて英語も書く。それで話が続く。別にその単語はみんな覚えなくて OK。なんかこの会話のための単語になる。
その説明っていうのはラッセル先生の方からして、別にそういうふうに言ってきた子たちに対して自分たちで説明させたりとか、そういったことは特にしていないわけですね。
それはあまりないかもね。
はい、わかりました。あともう一つさっきのタイムトゥライトなんですけど、あれは大体、時間的にはどのぐらいの時間取ってやってますか？
グレード9は大体6分、7分ぐらい。グレード11、12は10分ぐらいかな。
6分、7分から10分。はい、わかりました。ありがとうございました。
はい、他に質問がある方いらっしゃいましたら、お願いします。もう時間があまりないので、多分最後の質問ぐらいになっちゃうんじゃないかと思うんですけど。ないかな。じゃあ僕の方から一ついいですか？じゃあ、ラッセル先生、僕の方からなんですけど、
はい、
ラッセル先生、いろいろEasy Japanese .com とかで、日本語で読める物語を出版してらっしゃいますけど、それは今回の TPRS で使うものですか？それともそれとは違うんですかね？
そう、それは例えば、これがあるんですけど、短編集。これは、すごい、ユニークワードが少ない。この本には、53、53 unique words。だからなんか僕は教科書使わないけど、これはなんか僕のカリキュラムとして使ってる。なんかちょっとずつは正しい単語出てくるから、何回も繰り返すから、これ使える。あと、なんかカタカナと漢字全然使わないエディションとかあるから、グレード9にはそれ結構助かる。僕はグレード9のみんなにカタカナを教えない。それは、グレード10からスタートするから、そのように書いてる。その短編集と小説は2つある。もう一つのグレード9かグレード10のレベルぐらいと、もうちょっとシニアの方の小説も。
ありがとうございます。で、そういうのはeasyjapanese.com の他にAmazon とかでも購入できるんですよね、確か。
あれ？
聞こえますか？もしもし。
はい、今聞こえる。
そういう先生が作られた物語とかは Amazon とかでも購入できるんでしたっけ？
まあ、多分誰か、私のプリンターから買って Amazon で売ってるけど、私は Amazon から売ってない。そう。
それはひどい。
だからまあ、全然このためじゃなかったけど、
わかりました。はい。わかりました。はい、すみません。じゃあ、Amazon はあんまり皆さん買わない方がいいかもしれない。じゃあ、easyjapanese.com の方がいいですね、こちらね。はい。
ありがとうございます。
はい。わかりました。はい。じゃあもう、すみません。最後に、じゃあ、僕の方からちょっとまたご連絡くれます。本当に、まず最初に、マシュー・ラッセル先生、今日は本当にとっても貴重な話をありがとうございました。この TPRS についてはいつもアンケートで、TPRS の話を、 してほしいっていうリクエストがとても多かったんですけど、今までその話をしてくれる人が見つからなくてですね、本当にようやくラッセル先生にその話をしてもらうことができて、僕もとても嬉しく思っています。はい、ありがとうございました。はい、ではですね、ちょっとアンケート、アンケートにお願いしたいのですが、今、アンケートを、チャットボックスに入れますので、はい、今、チャットボックスにアンケートの、リンクを、ポストしました。もう本当にすぐ終わりますので、よろしければご回答いただければと思います。それから3月の予定なんですが、ちょっとですね、予定していた先生が休養で、ちょっと辞退されてしまって、今のところまだ予定が立っていません。ですが、予定が分かり次第、すぐにお知らせしたいと思いますので、また3月の多分下旬ぐらいになると思いますが、ぜひご参加ください。はい、それでは本日はここまでで終了とさせていただきたいと思います。本当に皆さんご参加くださいましてありがとうございました。それからラッセル先生もね、やはり一番話していただきましてありがとうございました。では、はい。じゃあ一回ミュート外しましょうか。ちょっと待ってください。はい、今ミュート外しました。はい。じゃあ本当に皆さんありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
And the boy is so good.
ありがとうございました。
No? No? Oh, just
はいはい。ちょっと待って今来て。
宮本さんお久しぶりです。
はい。じゃあもうこれで録画を終了させますね。はい。